Turn off the lights, lock your doors, and be silent. Because the story you're about to hear works best in the quiet, when every sound feels louder and your mind starts imagining things on its own. Before we go further, tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from and what time is it right now? So without any further discussion, let's begin. The thing people never understand about siblings is that the bond doesn't form from big moments, it's the small ones. The midnight whispers across a shared room because thunderstorms made him nervous. The mornings when he'd crawl into my bed before school and fall asleep again. The slow, habitual routines that build a kind of second heartbeat between two people. I didn't just grow up with my younger brother, I grew up around him. He was a part of every corner of my days, a shadow that followed me, a presence I didn't even have to look at to know exactly what he was feeling. Our parents worked too much to notice the details. They loved us, sure, but in that vague, broad-stroke way that left gaps for me to fill. I knew his nightmares, his speech patterns, the way his right foot turned slightly inward when he ran, the subtle rise in his voice when he was lying. He was predictable in the softest, most comforting way, like knowing the house creaked at exactly 11:07 every night, or that our dog barked at the mailman but never the delivery trucks. That predictability is what made his absence during summer camp feel so strange. The first night he was gone, the house felt too quiet. I stood in his doorway longer than I needed to, staring at the unmade bed, the pile of stuffed animals in the corner, the half-finished puzzle he'd insisted on completing before he left. It was stupid to feel like something was missing, but that's the thing about a person who fills your day-to-day life. They leave behind an echo when they're gone. Camp was a tradition. 2 weeks every summer, tucked away near the woods about an hour and a half from our suburban neighborhood. He always came back sunburned and muddy and full of stories about counselors who let them stay up late, or kids who cheated at canoe races. Every year he ran to me first when he got off the bus, practically knocking me over with how hard he hugged me. This year was supposed to be the same. It wasn't. Pickup day should have felt normal. The air was thick with heat, the sky that washed-out blue that comes after a long stretch of sun, and the highway shimmered like a mirage. Parents were already gathering when we arrived, some waving, some holding their phones up to record. Kids poured out of the bus, loud and sweaty and dragging suitcases that bounced awkwardly behind them. I waited for the usual sound. My name shouted from somewhere in the cluster of kids, that high, excited pitch he always used when he spotted me. Nothing. He stepped off the bus slowly, scanning the crowd, as if searching for something he wasn't entirely sure existed. His movements were stiff, almost rehearsed. When his eyes finally landed on us, there wasn't that spark of recognition. No running, no grin. He walked over like he was approaching strangers he'd been told to trust. I tried to laugh it off at first. Maybe he was tired, maybe camp wore him out this year. But when I knelt down to hug him, he hesitated. Actually hesitated. His arms went around me a moment later, but the pressure was off, limp and brief, nothing like the full-bodied squeeze he always gave. His eyes looked duller somehow, or emptier, like he was watching something behind me instead of looking right at me. Something small and cold twisted in my stomach, but I pushed it away. Kids change. Sometimes they grow up a little after 2 weeks away. At least that's what I told myself. The car ride home didn't help. He kept glancing out the window, studying the houses as if he didn't recognize the streets we'd driven hundreds of times. When our parents asked how camp was, he paused before answering, like he had to think too hard about something that should have been effortless.
"It was fine," he said. He never said fine, not once in his life. He was either ecstatic or dramatic or complaining or rambling for hours, but never just fine. A tiny, splinter-thin line of unease slid under my skin and stayed there. When we pulled into our driveway, he didn't move at first. He just stared at the front door, not with excitement, not even with relief, more like someone staring at a house they'd only seen in pictures. "You okay?" I asked quietly. No answer. He blinked, forced a tiny smile that didn't reach his eyes, and followed us inside. Walking behind him felt like watching someone pretend to be familiar with a space they'd only studied from a distance. He paused near the entryway table, running his fingers over the wooden edge, like he was feeling the grooves for the first time. He stood in the living room doorway too long. He touched the couch cushion, pressed it slightly, like he expected it to feel a different texture. Our parents didn't notice, of course they didn't, but I stared at that fork like it was a loaded gun. Then he said it. "Do we always eat like this?" He asked it plainly, as if he genuinely didn't know the answer. Mom thought he meant the vegetables, teased him about camp food ruining real meals, but his expression didn't shift. He looked at the plates, the cutlery, the arrangement of everything, like maybe this wasn't how things were supposed to be set. Like maybe he was comparing it to something else. He took tiny bites, methodical, silent. His chewing pattern wasn't even right. He used to pop food into his mouth like a chipmunk storing for winter. Tonight, he ate like he'd watched someone else do it and was trying to mimic it exactly. He kept glancing toward the hallway, toward the bedrooms, toward the stairs, like he was orienting himself, mapping the house, memorizing. Later that night, after he went to bed, I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Maybe camp had changed him. Maybe kids came back different sometimes, more mature, more withdrawn. But before I went to sleep, I heard movement near his room and peeked down the hall. He was standing in the doorway again, still, silent, just staring at the room, his room, like it was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. He stepped inside, touched the edge of his desk, then the dresser, then the closet door. Each touch was slow, deliberate, almost reverent. Then he reached out and pressed his hand flat against the wall beside his bed. Not like a kid checking for spiders or feeling the paint, more like someone checking the shape of a space they'd only heard described. He whispered something, but I couldn't make out the words. It didn't sound like his voice, not the pitch, not the cadence. My chest tightened, breath catching in that strange, instinctive way that only happens when something fundamental feels wrong. He moved his hand down the wall, fingers tracing lightly, and then he smiled. Not a warm smile, not a happy smile, a recognition smile, a "there you are" smile, like he'd finally found something he'd been searching for. He walked back to bed, lay down without shifting the blankets, and stared at the ceiling, eyes open long after everything else in the house went quiet. I told myself to sleep, to shake it off, to stop spiraling. But the last image of him lying perfectly still, eyes open in the dark, replayed again and again in my mind. My body refused to relax. My heart felt like it was beating in the wrong rhythm. People think horror starts big, with screams or monsters under the bed. But it doesn't. It starts small. A moment that doesn't fit. A behavior slightly out of place. A person you know better than anyone suddenly feeling like a stranger wearing a familiar face. And sometimes that moment is enough to split your entire life in half. Before him, after him. Something came home from camp. But deep down, in a place I didn't want to look too closely at, I knew it wasn't my brother. The morning after he returned from camp, the house carried an unfamiliar weight. Sunlight poured through the blinds, but it didn't feel warm. It felt like it was observing, slicing across surfaces with judgmental precision. The coffee machine hissed and sputtered in the kitchen. The hum of the fridge sounded too loud, and the ticking of the wall clock was sharper somehow, like it had been rewound while I wasn't looking.
He emerged from his room almost at the same time I did, rubbing his eyes. I watched him from the kitchen doorway. His hair was mussed in a way that seemed deliberate, not random, like he had arranged it without needing a mirror. He yawned, stretching in a rhythm that wasn't quite right, his spine bending at odd angles. "Morning," I said, expecting him to respond in his usual energetic tone. He blinked at me, then smiled faintly. "Morning." It wasn't wrong in words, it was wrong in rhythm. The syllables came out in uniform, precise bursts, like a recording being played back at the wrong speed. My chest tightened again, a quiet echo of the unease that had started the night before. I decided to watch him more carefully, starting small. At breakfast, he poured cereal into a bowl, but instead of shaking the box over the bowl like he always did, scattering bits with an almost careless glee, he measured them like he was performing a chemistry experiment. Each piece dropped in with a deliberate tap, careful, controlled. I tried to rationalize. Maybe camp instilled discipline. Maybe he had learned to be more tidier or more careful or less wild. But nothing about the way he carried himself matched him. The way his foot landed on the floor, the way he picked up the spoon, the way he glanced at the syrup bottle like it was some alien artifact he needed to examine. And then he did something that made my blood go cold. He hesitated at the doorway to his room just long enough to study the layout before entering. He paused by the desk, ran a hand across the top of it, and crouched slightly, tilting his head, not in curiosity, not in recognition, but as though learning the room for the very first time. Later that morning, I made an excuse to pass by his room. The door was slightly ajar. From the hallway, I caught him standing over the bed. He wasn't sleeping. He was arranging the stuffed animals, straightening them with a precision that made my skin crawl. I whispered his name, and he flinched, quick, jerky, defensive, not like he had been startled before. This was a muscle memory reaction he shouldn't have had. Then he froze, glanced toward me, smiled faintly, and went back to his task. I wanted to ask him why he was behaving like this, but the words stuck in my throat. Something about him had shifted, something fundamental. By the second day, the anomalies had compounded. During dinner, he asked again about how we always ate. "Do we always eat like this?" He was watching everyone at the table, noting how they held their forks, where their elbows rested, the position of the salt and pepper shakers. It wasn't curiosity, it was analysis, the way a stranger would study a home before committing a crime, not a child returning to the comfort of family. When mom or dad laughed and brushed it off, I remained silent, my eyes tracking him, noting every twitch, every hesitation, every misaligned gesture. He lifted the napkin to his mouth, left hand again. He picked up the bread knife as if memorizing its weight. He passed the butter dish like he had never seen it before. The first night, it became impossible to ignore. I was in the living room, the dim glow of the hallway lights spilling across the carpet. The house had settled into its usual quiet, but something was off, a faint sound from the closet in his room. It started as a whisper, soft, almost imperceptible, like someone practicing speaking in a language they didn't know. I froze. "Come here." The words didn't make sense. They were fragmented, strange, deliberate, but in unmistakably his voice, or a voice mimicking him. I crept toward the room, heart hammering, and stopped just outside. The whispering stopped the moment I reached the doorway. He was lying in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. When I asked what he was doing, he said, flatly, "Nothing. Nothing." But I knew. Something else was moving in that room, something alive, something studying him. Over the next few days, subtle patterns became obvious. Objects that should have stayed in their usual spots were moved slightly, almost imperceptibly. His favorite toy car no longer sat atop the dresser, but balanced on its side on the floor. His backpack, which he usually dumped beside the bed, was tucked under the desk at a precise angle. Even the family photos on the wall seemed slightly skewed, frames not hanging straight, edges perfectly aligned by someone meticulous. And then came the small personal deviations, words, phrases he didn't use. He asked about mathematical sequences in bedtime stories he'd never cared about. He used words like observe and categorize in casual conversation, terms that were alien to him. Even the way he laughed had a mechanical rhythm, regular, measured, like a recording looped imperfectly. Friends began to notice too. At pickup, one of his classmates waved, expecting the usual high-pitched greeting. Instead, he nodded, a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. Another classmate whispered a joke about the camp canoe race they had laughed about all summer. He froze, blinked, and gave a blank, polite smile. No laughter, no memory. I watched him. My stomach churned. He was almost right. The gestures, the tone, the patterns, they were all there, but something essential was missing. Something that made the familiar suddenly alien. One night, I was too restless to sleep. I went to check on him. His room was dark, except for the moonlight through the blinds. I could hear it again, the whispering, coming from the closet this time. They don't know. I froze in the doorway. The words were clear. They were planning, or at least thinking beyond what a normal child would. He moved toward the closet, slid the door open, and spoke softly to the darkness inside. I won't let them see me. I blinked. The words sank into my chest like ice. He turned slowly, as if sensing me there. The smile on his face was wrong, wide enough to look natural, but cold, calculated. I couldn't speak. He closed the closet door, climbed into bed, and lay still, pretending to sleep. But I couldn't shake the sound of that whisper. The next day, I went digging in the old family photo albums, looking for some reassurance, something to tell me it was all in my head. I found a picture of him as a toddler, sitting on the couch in the same living room. I froze. It wasn't him, or at least it wasn't exactly him. The face was slightly blurred, like a smear in an old photograph. Features were off by a fraction. Eyes set differently, a hint of a crooked smile that never belonged. I flipped through more albums, the photos that should have shown him as he grew older. Every face matched, but something had been scratched out in each one. Tiny lines over his features, careful and precise. I realized then that the feeling in my chest, the one I'd been trying to ignore, wasn't paranoia, it was recognition. Something wasn't right. Something had returned from camp, but it wasn't my brother. By the end of this week, the house was quieter than usual. Not peaceful quiet, tense, loaded quiet. Every sound, footsteps, the fridge humming, the whisper of the fan, felt like it was being measured, assessed, recorded. And I couldn't tell anyone. My parents dismissed my concerns, labeling my unease as stress, as jealousy, as overprotectiveness. But I knew the difference between my brother and what sat across from me at breakfast. The wrong child had come home, and the wrong child was learning. By the end of the first week, the unease in the house had become a constant thrum. I tried to anchor myself with logic, but every interaction with him chipped away at it. Something in his eyes no longer reflected the person I'd grown up with. Every smile, every laugh, every casual gesture, just slightly wrong, like a song played one semitone off. If the wrongness had been limited to our house, I might have convinced myself I was imagining it. But when I started looking outside, things got stranger. I called the camp. Maybe this was just a misunderstanding. a miscommunication, something explainable. The camp secretary sounded polite, almost rehearsed. I asked about my brother. "Yes, he returned safely. Everything went according to schedule," she said. Her voice didn't waver, but there was a strange stiffness beneath it. I pressed for details. I asked for the counselor assigned to his cabin. A pause, then a name. When I finally spoke to the counselor, the tone was vague, almost evasive. "Yes, I remember him, or maybe the other cabin?" "Other cabin?" "There was a mix-up with the bunk lists. Some kids were moved to a different cabin in the middle of the night. Nobody knows why. The counselors wouldn't explain, and the kids were told not to mention it." Her words were careful, measured, but the hesitance, the subtle falter of memory made my stomach twist. It wasn't trauma, it wasn't fatigue, it was confusion or avoidance. Something had happened at camp that no one wanted to talk about. Next, I reached out to one of his camp friends' parents. "Yes, there was a nighttime incident," she said quietly, leaning toward the phone as though afraid someone would overhear. "Some kids were moved to a different cabin in the middle of the night. Nobody knows why. The counselors wouldn't explain, and the kids were told not to mention it." I asked if she remembered which children. She hesitated. I mean, my son said, "It's all fuzzy, but one kid, something about him changed after that night. He wasn't the same when he came home. I thought he was just tired, but..." Her voice trailed off. I felt the old cold ache in my chest. I began digging through my phone and old camp photos. There was one taken on the last day, group photo near the lake. Everyone's faces were clear, except his, slightly blurred, like motion during the shutter, or like he wasn't supposed to be there. I zoomed in, studied the photo. Something was wrong with the blur, not a simple camera error. Something about the outline of his face. It looked wrong, subtly misaligned. I stared at it for hours. His body, posture, clothing, all right. Face, different. And for the first time, I realized maybe I wasn't imagining the little things at home. Maybe someone or something had been swapped. Growing up, I had watched him closely, shared every secret, every bedtime ritual, every small expression that was his alone. He didn't just have habits, he had rhythms. The way he laughed when surprised, the way he pulled his blanket tight around his shoulders when scared, the way he carried books. And now, nothing matched. I began cataloging the differences. The way he carried himself was too deliberate. He spoke in patterns, like he was trying to mimic speech. Familiar words he never used now slipped from his lips effortlessly. He looked at objects in our house as if seeing them for the first time, cataloging them. And yet, he smiled like my brother. He laughed like my brother. He cried like my brother. All the things that made him recognizable were there, but wrong. Curiosity gnawed at me. I started talking to neighbors, quietly, casually. At first, they smiled politely, but then one, an older woman who'd lived in the neighborhood for decades, paused mid-conversation. "You know, kids go missing all the time at that camp, mostly just a night or two, but sometimes a child comes back different. Doesn't mean anything to anyone, but..." I pressed her. She shook her head. "It's nothing, just a story. We've lived here long enough to forget."
The hesitation, the way she didn't finish her thought, it was the same pattern. Everyone knew something happened, but nobody spoke directly about it. At home, small patterns persisted. He woke up at 3 a.m. precisely, standing in the hallway, staring toward the basement. Words he'd never used in his vocabulary slipped into casual conversation. Observe, categorize, sequence. He avoided old jokes, games, favorite stories or phrases.
blankly smiling when friends asked. I tried to confront him once. "You remember when we used to," I began. He interrupted, calm. "I do not remember." The words were plain, polite, and wrong. I began keeping a small notebook, each anomaly I noticed, each slight deviation from the person I knew, I wrote down. Tuesday, breakfast fork in left hand. Wednesday, whispered to closet. Thursday, did not recognize childhood bedtime story. Friday, stared at basement door at 3 a.m. The list grew longer than I wanted to acknowledge, each observation a brick in a wall I could no longer ignore. This was not him. One night, while cleaning his room quietly, I came across a drawer I didn't remember existing. Inside, I found a small folded note torn from a notebook, in childish handwriting I didn't recognize. "He isn't your brother." My stomach turned to ice. I held the note, my mind racing. Camp counselors had mentioned a child wandering at night. Parents were silent, oblivious, or in denial. And now this note hidden inside his own room suggested what I had suspected. I realized the person who returned from camp was not my brother. That night I stayed awake. The house was dark, quiet, the air heavy. I heard him again, whispering, soft, almost melodic, but wrong. Words I couldn't decipher, speaking to someone or something in the closet. "They think I'm him." It was the first time I clearly understood what was happening. He was aware of the deception, aware of the role he had to play, and he was practicing. I tried to talk to my parents, tried to tell them in the gentlest way possible that something was wrong, but their response was immediate. "You're imagining it. He's tired. He's been at camp. Don't overthink things." I couldn't argue with them. They refused to see. Everyone else in the world refused to see. The weight of that knowledge settled onto me like a second skin. I was alone, and the person in my house was watching me just as intently as I watched him. The first night of real escalation, I understood something crucial. I wasn't imagining the strangeness, and I wasn't paranoid. He was performing, learning, adapting. But it wasn't just mimicry anymore. It was something more deliberate, more calculating. I woke to the soft creak of the floorboards outside my room. My heart clenched. The moonlight poured thin and silvery through the blinds, illuminating the hallway. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the old house settling. But then I noticed the pattern. At 3 a.m., like clockwork, he appeared, standing in the hallway, still as a statue, eyes fixed on the basement door. My stomach dropped. My chest was tight with dread. Not fear alone, but a knowing, a realization that what I was looking at wasn't normal. He didn't move toward the basement, didn't make a sound, just observed, like something hidden, something ancient that only I could see. Over the next few days, subtle things multiplied. Words and phrases he used began to shift. Expressions I had grown up with, phrases only he would say in a certain tone, disappeared. Instead, he spoke like someone who had studied the language carefully, measuring each syllable. Observe, categorize, sequence. I caught him whispering to himself in the dark, "They won't see. They can't see." The soft repetition of these words, repeated quietly to the air in the closet, sent a shiver through me. The closet had become a stage, and he the actor, practicing lines only I could hear. I tried to involve friends and neighbors, but it was impossible. At school, classmates noticed nothing. Inside jokes fell flat. When asked about his favorite games, he answered with generic, polite smiles. "You're remembering that wrong," he said once, perfectly calm, to a friend recounting a shared memory. He could pass as my brother to anyone who didn't know him as intimately as I did. To everyone else, the anomalies were invisible, imperceptible, but I could see them. I could feel them in the hollow spaces beneath his expressions, in the way he moved. The basement had always been a place I avoided after dark, a cool, dim room with the musty smell of stored boxes and old furniture. One night, drawn by a feeling I couldn't ignore, I descended the stairs quietly. He was there, standing in the center of the room, not playing, not sleeping, not exploring, just standing. His eyes were closed, but he was muttering, softly, deliberately, "They think I'm him. They think I'm him." I froze. Something about the rhythm, the cadence of his voice was wrong, too precise, almost hypnotic, almost rehearsed. I stepped closer. He opened his eyes. They weren't empty, they were aware. They pierced the dim light like something belonging elsewhere, something that had learned to observe before acting. And then he smiled. Not the smile I knew, not the one I could recognize in an instant. A smile too practiced, too even, too perfect. As the week progressed, the staring became a new constant feature. It wasn't just in the basement, it happened at the breakfast table, it happened during homework. He would pause, head tilting slightly, eyes fixing on me. Not aggressively, not threateningly, observationally, as if he was mapping me, memorizing the details of my face, my gestures, my expressions. I began to notice small, cruel deviations from habit. He would mimic things I did, but with tiny delays. He'd copy movements exactly, but always just slightly behind me, as if rehearsing my life. One evening, I confronted him indirectly. I asked him to look in the mirror with me. "Do you remember yourself?" I asked softly. He stared, tilted his head, then nodded. Yes. But the reflection didn't match him, not fully. Subtle differences, the way his jawline caught the light, the tilt of his eyes, the set of his shoulders, almost imperceptible, but there. And when he smiled at his reflection, it was a perfect imitation, flawless, deliberate. I realized then he wasn't trying to act like my brother. He was trying to become him. Small signs of aggression began to appear, not outbursts or tantrums, but quiet, precise acts of control. A broken vase placed carefully on the floor as if testing gravity. The dog left trembling in its bed, though he had not raised his hand. Furniture slightly shifted, corners bumped, objects nudged in ways to unsettle without alarming. It wasn't chaos, it was calculated. It was observation turned manipulation, and it was growing. The first tangible proof came unexpectedly. While searching for something mundane, I found his camp backpack hidden behind the dryer. Inside was a torn camp shirt and a note, scrawled in small, hurried handwriting. "He isn't your brother." My hands shook. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't a dream. This was real. I pieced together what I had suspected. The whispers, the precision, the mimicry. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't temporary. Something or someone had replaced my brother. I sought out the counselor I had spoken to before, pressing harder. "There was a child found wandering at night," she admitted reluctantly. "He refused to give a name. He stayed with us the rest of the camp quietly, but we couldn't get him to interact normally. Everyone assumed he'd leave eventually." The words felt like a hammer to the chest. The camp had found him, yes, but it didn't end there. The note, the mimicry, the whispers, it all lined up. One night, lying awake listening to the house breathe around me, I realized the worst part. He was aware of what I knew. The whispers weren't just practice, they were rehearsals of deception. The movements weren't just mimicry, they were learning. And every tiny misstep, Every variation, every moment I noticed, he could sense. He was adapting. By midweek, information trickled in from other sources. School friends mentioned oddities they noticed but hadn't understood. Inside jokes met with polite smiles. Games that had been favorites suddenly forgotten. Details of events recounted incorrectly, with hesitation and forced precision. I realized then that his presence wasn't just a local anomaly, it had extended outward. The longer he remained, the more carefully he masked his differences, but each slip left cracks only I could see. By now, the closet whispers were nightly, growing more coherent. They think I'm him. They can't tell. Must be perfect. I crouched outside the door one night, listening. The air thickened. My chest tightened as if the room itself were pressing against me. He was aware of the switch. He was practicing. He was preparing. And if he could hide in the closet, he could hide anywhere. No one believed me. Parents dismissed my concerns as childish suspicion, jealousy, or overreaction. Friends shrugged when I tried to explain small details. The world didn't see what I saw. I realized then that I was alone, completely. The wrong child had not only returned to our home, but it had also learned how to exist in it undetected, except for me. The house had become a stage, the night had become a rehearsal space, and I was the only audience member who could see the truth. If he could mimic my brother perfectly, then what about the person who never returned from camp? By the second week after his return from camp, the subtle dread that had been threading through the house became impossible to ignore. Each day, each hour, each quiet moment seemed deliberately orchestrated to unsettle, to reveal just enough that I could feel the wrongness in my bones. The whispers from the closet continued nightly. The deliberate mimicry, the small behavioral errors, the pauses in memory. It all culminated in a realization that refused to let me breathe. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't trauma. This was identity theft. And then I found the backpack. I had been looking for a lost notebook, bending behind the dryer to retrieve it when something caught my eye. A backpack. Dirty, worn, shoved against the wall in a place no one would notice. It wasn't his usual one. It was older, torn in places, with a smell that carried dampness and earth. Inside was a camp shirt, ripped and stained, and beneath it, a folded note. I unfolded it carefully, hands trembling. The words were written in small, hurried handwriting I didn't recognize. "He isn't your brother." My stomach churned, my heart pounded. The message confirmed what I had been trying to deny. The subtle shifts, the strange behaviors, the whispers, they weren't just quirks of a child returning from camp. Something or someone had taken his place. I returned to the camp counselor I had contacted before, pressing harder this time. I needed clarity, no matter how disturbing. "There was a child," she said quietly, almost whispering as though afraid someone might overhear. "One night, during cabin reassignments, a boy wandered off. He refused to give his name. We tried to coax him, but he wouldn't speak. He stayed with the camp staff, mostly in silence until pickup day." I pressed further. "Did he go home?" "Not exactly. The child who left with the bus wasn't the same one we had on the roster. Something happened during the night. No one knows exactly what. The counselors assumed it was just an odd situation. We recorded it, but well, some things were left unresolved." Her words were cautious, evasive, but precise enough to confirm what I feared. I pieced together small clues that now felt terrifyingly deliberate. The blurred face in the last camp photo, the whispers in the closet, the deliberate mimicry of every gesture, phrase, and behavior, the misplaced objects, the subtle distortions in routine, and now the note in the backpack. The truth was no longer a suspicion, It was undeniable. The child who returned was not my brother. One night, I stayed awake, crouched in the hallway outside his room. The closet door was slightly ajar. He was whispering, softly, almost melodic. "They think I'm him. They can't see. Must be perfect." The cadence, the repetition, the meticulous practice of speech, it was more than mimicry. It was preparation. And then he whispered something that froze me entirely. "They think I'm him, but I'm not." The voice wasn't just him. It was aware of what he was doing, aware of what I knew, aware of the life he was trying to steal. It wasn't just identity theft, it was a replacement. For the first time, I considered the horrifying possibility the real brother was still out there somewhere, injured or trapped or hidden away, and the one in my house was practicing to be him. I could feel the weight of time pressing down on me. Every minute that passed, every day he spent at home, he became more indistinguishable from the person I had known. And the longer this went unnoticed by everyone else, the closer it became to permanence. It was during a quiet search through the basement that I stumbled onto a deeper secret. Behind a false panel, tucked under the floorboards, I found a small bundle, a journal, photographs, notes, evidence of a history that no one had intended me to find. The journal belonged to my parents. The entries were meticulous, detailing a decision I could barely comprehend. One child, my real brother, had been in danger. The other, the imposter, had been brought home deliberately. The words hit me like a physical blow. We had no choice. One child had to be saved. We accepted the other to protect him. No one can know. The implication was almost impossible to digest. My parents, the people I had trusted completely, had made a deal. They had knowingly brought the wrong child home to protect the real one. I returned to his room, the journal clutched in my hand. I watched him sleep. His features were almost perfect, almost indistinguishable from the boy I had grown up with, but I could see it in the way he breathed, the tension in his hands, the slight delay in his reactions. He wasn't my brother. He had been trained, molded, and rehearsed into the shape of someone I knew intimately. And yet, he wanted to be him. I realized then the terrifying truth. He wasn't just an imposter, he was aware of his role, and he had been preparing to assume it fully. As if on cue, a memory surfaced. From the camp counselor's admission, a child had been found wandering at night, refused to speak, isolated, left behind in some hidden way. My stomach twisted. The real brother hadn't returned. He had been trapped somewhere, unseen, overlooked, a casualty of circumstance, or worse, a victim of my parents' decision. And the boy in my house, the one I had called my brother for weeks, was the replacement, the substitute, the imposter. That night, I watched from the doorway again. He whispered to the closet, words almost audible. "They think I'm him, but I'm learning. Perfect." And it hit me. He wasn't just mimicking, he was strategizing. He knew someone suspected. He knew I was observing, and he was adapting. The subtle dread that had been building now became something heavier, a tangible presence in the house. It pressed against my chest, settled behind my eyes, whispered in the spaces where silence should have been. I had been right all along, and I had no one to tell. I wanted to confront him, wanted to demand answers, wanted to shout and shake him and see if there was anything of the brother I had known left inside. But I hesitated. I feared the answer. The answer might not just be unpleasant, it might be dangerous. He was no longer a child in the usual sense. He was calculating, observant, adaptive, and he could outthink me. Everything changed in that instant. The house, once familiar, became alien. Every creak, every shadow, every whisper now held potential threat. I couldn't leave the house with fear. I couldn't trust anyone. My parents, blissfully unaware or willfully ignoring, were nurturing the wrong child. And the wrong child was learning too fast. The game had shifted. The imposter wasn't just mimicking my brother anymore. He was becoming him. And somewhere out there, the real brother was alone, waiting, vulnerable, endangered by the very people who were supposed to protect him. By now, the house had become a stage of quiet, almost imperceptible terror. Every movement, every sound, every shadow felt deliberate, controlled. The wrong child, my brother's imposter, was no longer just mimicking. He was testing boundaries, probing reactions, learning what he could do without being noticed. The morning began with the usual routine, breakfast, but even this small, mundane ritual had become tense. He studied the table, the way my parents poured their cereal, how I sat in my chair. He adjusted his own posture to match me, copied gestures subtly, and smiled when I looked at him. But there was a coldness in the precision, a deliberateness in every motion that made the pit in my stomach grow. I had started keeping a notebook again, documenting every anomaly. Every day added more evidence. Objects subtly moved or rearranged, unnatural precision in gestures and speech, whispers in the closet late at night, blank responses to shared memories. And now new patterns were emerging, patterns that were frighteningly aggressive. The first act that truly unsettled me happened during a quiet evening. I had gone to retrieve a book from the living room when I noticed a small vase lying on the floor. It wasn't shattered, just tipped, balanced carefully, as if someone had tested gravity and wanted me to notice. Later, our dog, usually fearless and playful, stayed pressed against the wall, ears flattened, eyes wide. Nothing had happened to provoke it, no loud noise, no scolding, but I noticed him standing near the stairs, watching the dog, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk on his face. I realized the truth. He was testing responses, learning what scared, what unsettled, what went unnoticed. I tried to confide in a teacher at school, a counselor I trusted. I described the changes I'd seen, but they brushed it off. Kids come back from camp differently, they said. It's normal to notice changes. You're overthinking. Even friends' parents, when I mentioned the odd behaviors, dismissed me as overprotective. They couldn't see what I saw. Only I noticed the slight shifts in posture, the way he avoided inside jokes, the cold precision in his movements. He was untouchable in plain sight. It became clear that the night was his domain. He began waking up at exactly 3 a.m., standing silently in the hallway, staring at the basement door. Sometimes he would whisper softly, as though practicing for an audience of one. What they can't see must be perfect. I tried following him once, just to observe. He led me in silence to the closet, opened the door, and muttered words I couldn't understand. Then he closed it carefully, returned to bed, and pretended to sleep. The precision, the control, the awareness of my observation, every move deliberate, every action calculated. What made the danger truly insidious was my parents' refusal to see it. When I raised concerns, "He's just tired from camp," Mom said. "You're imagining things," Dad added. No alarms, no acknowledgement, just polite dismissal. My warnings were brushed aside as jealousy or overreaction. This gave him space to test, to probe, to escalate without consequence. It was the neighbor who finally gave me concrete evidence of danger. One morning, she stopped me in the driveway. "I saw him last night," she said, voice low, eyes darting. "I walked into the woods around midnight, didn't even touch the ground like a normal kid. I thought it was a dream."
I froze. He was supposed to be in bed. The implication was chilling. He was capable of movement outside the house without being noticed. He was practicing independence, stealth, exploration. I began to suspect the basement was his real training ground. Objects moved subtly, dust disturbed in impossible patterns, footprints that didn't match shoes, shadows that seemed to linger in impossible ways.
One night, I followed him down. He was standing perfectly still, eyes closed, whispering. The darkness seemed to bend around him, drawing my attention to subtle signs. A chair pushed against the wall in a deliberate angle. Boxes shifted, leaving paths clear as if for ritualistic movement. A faint scent of earth, dirt, and something organic I couldn't place. And then he opened his eyes. They were too sharp, too aware, too knowing. Small incidents began escalating. He broke objects quietly, with precision, always leaving evidence that seemed accidental. He stared at family members while they slept, motionless, observing every twitch and breath. He left subtle threats, notes tucked in corners, objects displaced to convey unseen messages. The house had become a minefield. Every sound, every shadow, every movement had potential consequences. I realized something terrifying. He was strategically escalating the threat. He wasn't random. He wasn't chaotic. He was methodical, calculating. And the more I documented it, the more aware he became. He had learned that I was observing, and now he was adapting to my scrutiny. Every night, the whispers from the closet grew longer, more coherent, more deliberate. They think I'm him. Perfect. Must be perfect. He wasn't just living my brother's life, he was planning to take it completely. The escalation turned physical in the most subtle way. One night I approached him in his room, trying to confront him, quietly, calmly. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. He didn't flinch, didn't react like a child. He smiled. "I'm just learning," he said softly. And then he advanced, not violently, not aggressively, but with precision. Every step measured, his eyes locked on mine. The room felt smaller, heavier, charged with tension. I backed away. He mirrored my movements perfectly, always a step behind, always matching my body language. It was a trap, a controlled game, and I was losing. I tried alerting my parents again. I tried to explain the escalating danger. "Stop obsessing," they said. "He's your brother. He's fine." Every attempt to warn them failed. Every attempt to intervene alone was dangerous. I was isolated, completely, and he knew it. The wrong child could act, move, whisper, manipulate, and no one would notice except me. By now, I was spending nights awake, listening. The whispers were deliberate, almost rehearsed. I could hear him speaking in the dark, sometimes toward the closet, sometimes muttering to the empty room. They think I'm him. Perfect. Must be perfect. And then, I won't fail. I can do this. I must. It was no longer mimicry. It was intent, purpose, awareness. He was preparing for something, preparing to replace completely. He began shadowing my movements, quietly, without making a sound, watching when I left the room, when I entered the kitchen, when I looked away. He observed, he waited, he learned, and I realized if he wanted to hurt me or the real brother, he could do it quietly, carefully, with no one ever noticing. The danger wasn't random, it was methodical, patient, and lethal in subtlety. The longer this went on, the heavier the dread became. Every sound in the house, the tick of the clock, the hum of the fridge, the whisper of the wind, felt deliberate, measured, part of a game I had no chance of winning. And yet, I was trapped. The parents refused to see. Friends didn't understand. The world outside the house didn't matter. Only I could notice the subtle changes. Only I could document them. Only I could witness the growing threat. I understood then. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a mistake. This was a hostile presence in our home. The day felt wrong from the moment I woke up. Not in a loud, chaotic way, but in the quiet, oppressive sense that sits behind the ribs and makes every breath slightly heavier. He had been watching me more openly now, not hiding, not pretending, just observing. Sitting at the table with his hands folded too neatly, eyes unblinking for seconds too long, head tilting in a slow, curious arc every time I entered a room. He wasn't mimicking anymore. He wasn't practicing. He had perfected enough of my brother to stop trying. And when someone stops trying, it's because they're ready. That was the day I knew something was coming, something irreversible. It happened at 1:49 a.m. I saw him pass my bedroom door, not walking, but gliding with a careful stillness, each step placed in silence. He didn't notice me watching through the cracked doorway. He moved like someone who had rehearsed this path 100 times. Down the stairs, through the kitchen, to the sliding glass door, into the darkness behind our house. He didn't turn on a light. He didn't hesitate. He didn't check if anyone was awake. He already knew no one would be, except me. The night air felt colder than usual, thick with the scent of damp leaves and something else, a faint metallic smell, almost like rust. He walked ahead of me with disturbing assurance, not like a kid sneaking out, more like someone returning somewhere they belonged. I stayed far enough behind to avoid detection, but close enough to see him when the moonlight slipped through the branches. He wasn't walking toward town. He wasn't heading toward any of the familiar trails. He was going north, toward the abandoned part of the summer camp, toward the boundary fence the counselors had mentioned, the one they never explained, the one the kids whispered about but didn't dare approach. He moved faster as we approached the forest's edge, almost eager, almost excited, and then he crossed into the dark. I followed. There was something unnatural about the woods that night. The trees leaned in strange angles, branches forming unwanted shapes overhead, like a canopy designed to keep sound trapped beneath it. The deeper we walked, the quieter the world became. No crickets, no wind, no leaves rustling, just silence so complete it pressed against my eardrums. He slowed only once when we reached the boundary fence, a sagging, rusted structure overtaken by vines and time. The air around it felt heavier, colder, and then he slipped through a gap in the fence as though he had done it 1,000 times. I followed, feeling the metal scrape my arm. On the other side, the earth felt different beneath my shoes, softer, disturbed, like something had been moving here recently. The trees opened into a small clearing illuminated by moonlight. At the center, there was a circle of flattened grass, like something or someone had been lying there over and over again, resting, waiting. He stood at the center with his back to me, and then he spoke. Not to me, not to anyone visible, but to the empty air in front of him. "I came back," he whispered softly. "I'm ready." The word ready struck me with cold clarity. Ready for what? He bowed his head slightly as though listening. Then he nodded. "Okay," he said quietly. "He's here." My breath caught. He meant me. A sound broke the silence, a small, sharp gasp, weak, hoarse, desperate. From the shadows at the edge of the clearing, a shape stumbled forward, thin, dirty, terrified. My real brother. His face was scratched, pale, eyes wide with fear. He ran, or tried to, but collapsed just a few feet from me. His voice was barely a whisper. "Don't let it take me," he sobbed. "Please, please don't let it take my place again." The words lodged in my chest like a physical pain. Again. This wasn't the first attempt. This wasn't the first replacement. This was a ritual, a cycle, and he had been living through it alone. The imposter didn't whirl around dramatically. He didn't scream or hiss or run. He simply turned, slowly, deliberately, like he had been expecting this moment. His eyes didn't look like a child's anymore, not even close. They held depth where there shouldn't be depth, intention where there shouldn't be intention. He studied me first, then the real brother, then me again. "You found him," he said, voice calm, measured, disappointed. "You weren't supposed to." My real brother shook violently beside me. "He said he needed a family," he cried. "He said mine wasn't enough." The imposter tilted his head. "They agreed," he said quietly. "They made their choice." My heart froze. Our parents, the journal entries, the decision to save one child by accepting another. It was all true. He took a slow step toward us. "Your parents knew," he said softly. "They were told the same thing all the others were told. Only one child can leave the woods." Another step. "They wanted theirs to live." Another. "So they sent him back alone." He nodded toward my real brother and brought me home instead. My brother sobbed into the dirt. "He traded me," he whispered. "He traded me to save themselves." The imposter crouched down just a few feet away. "I wasn't finished learning," he said, voice calm, "but I'm ready now." He looked directly at me. "You see too much. You always have. That made it harder." A quiet pause. "But I can take your brother's life perfectly now. No one will ever know." My pulse hammered in my ears. "You're not taking him," I whispered. He smiled. "Then I'll take you." He moved with unnatural speed, not supernatural, just wrong. Too precise, too rehearsed, too confident. I grabbed a fallen branch and swung. He dodged effortlessly, mimicking the exact dodge my real brother would have used in a childhood game. He had studied everything, every fight, every reflex, every instinct. I wasn't fighting a child. I was fighting a perfected imitation. He lunged. I blocked. He grabbed my arm, fingers strong, cold. I twisted free and shoved him back. He landed on his feet like a gymnast, effortless. My real brother screamed my name behind me. The imposter lunged again, this time aiming for my throat. We fell into the grass, rolling, coughing as dirt filled my lungs. He clawed, not wildly, but strategically, aiming for leverage, for control, for dominance. He knew what he was doing. He was stronger than he should have been, faster than he should have been. No hesitation, no fatigue, no fear. But he wasn't perfect. He wasn't used to pain. I slammed an elbow into his ribs. He gasped, surprised, angry, and loosened his grip. I shoved him off and scrambled to my feet. "Run!" I yelled at my real brother. He couldn't run, but he crawled behind me as fast as he could. The imposter stood slowly, straightened his shirt, tilted his head. "You won't leave," he said quietly. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. He charged again, faster than before. I grabbed a broken piece of the fence lying on the ground and swung with everything I had. It connected, not fatally, but enough to knock him to one knee. His face twisted, not in pain, but in confusion, as if trying to understand why pain existed at all. I didn't wait for him to recover. I grabbed my real brother and dragged him toward the fence gap. The imposter rose slowly behind us. "This isn't over," he whispered. "I can still be him." His voice shook slightly for the first time, not with fear, with rage. "I will be him." Branches whipped at our faces as we tore through the trees. My brother stumbled and collapsed, but I hauled him up again. Behind us, I heard movement. Not running, not crashing, just steady, deliberate footsteps. He wasn't chasing, he was following, knowing he would find us eventually. We burst out of the woods and onto the back lawn, collapsing under the porch light. Everything felt unreal in the sudden brightness, the world too normal, too safe-looking. My brother sobbed into my shirt. "He won't stop," he whispered. "He told me he never stops." And I believed him. I saw him, standing at the edge of the woods, half hidden behind a tree, watching us, not moving, not approaching, just observing. The porch light painted a border he wouldn't cross, not yet. He raised one hand slowly, a wave, controlled, precise, a gesture my real brother used to do when we were kids. Then he stepped back into the darkness, gone, but not defeated. We brought my real brother inside, locked every door, every window, sat together in silence until dawn. But as morning light filled the house, something felt wrong. My real brother's breathing sounded different. His posture subtly changed. The way he held his spoon at breakfast, slightly off. Not wrong, just different. Almost like, no, he made it back. He had to. Except when he hugged me, he whispered, "Thank you for choosing me." And the way he said it, familiar, practiced, rehearsed. I froze. He looked up at me, smiled, too perfectly. The morning after the woods, the house felt heavier. The sun poured through the blinds in soft, pale streams, but it did little to warm the oppressive feeling that hung in the rooms. My real brother was home, sitting at the kitchen table, eating breakfast with careful precision. Every gesture, every sip, every bite, deliberate, almost measured. I watched him, my heart hammered with relief and dread, mingling in a bitter taste I couldn't shake. He was here, alive, safe, but the subtle wrongness remained. It started with small, almost imperceptible behaviors. He held his fork slightly differently. He hummed tunes he never learned. He tilted his head in ways that weren't his habit. He avoided certain childhood phrases only I would notice. The more I watched, the more the creeping realization settled in. This wasn't entirely my brother. Or maybe he had been changed. It didn't matter that he smiled, laughed, cried. Everything I remembered about him seemed intact. Everything except the nuances. Those nuances were enough. Days passed. I noticed something even stranger. Family photos. Old albums, once familiar, now seemed altered. Pictures of birthdays, vacations, and holidays slowly shifted in detail. Faces in older photos looked subtly different, scratches removed, expressions polished, small differences only I could detect. And sometimes in the corner of a photo, I could swear I saw a flicker of the imposter's features. It was as if reality itself were bending around the presence of someone who shouldn't exist. And worse, no one else noticed. One night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I heard him again, softly, from the darkened hallway. "I'm the right one now." The words cut through me. I froze, heart pounding, breath held. Was it a reassurance or a warning? The way he said it, calm, precise, certain, almost like a declaration of victory. And the way his eyes met mine from the darkness, steady, unwavering, made my skin crawl. It didn't take long for me to piece it together. The real brother had returned, but the wrong child had left something behind, a lingering presence, a seed of mimicry, of knowledge, of adaptation. The imposter had learned too much. Even after the struggle in the woods, something of him had survived. And my brother, even though he was safe physically, carried traces of that imitation. Everything I knew about him, the bond we shared, the trust, the rituals, the subtle mannerisms, was now partially contaminated. He smiled, laughed, and cried, but in ways I couldn't fully recognize anymore. My parents, oblivious, hugged him, kissed him, reassured themselves. "You're home, and that's all that matters," they said. But they didn't see. They didn't notice the twitch of his lips, the slight tilt of his hand, the careful rehearsing of movements I had memorized over years.
They couldn't see it. No one could, except me. And that made me more alone than ever. Weeks passed. The house returned to a semblance of normalcy. Lights on, breakfast at the table, school lunches packed, bedtime stories read. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted irrevocably. It was in the pauses between words, in the way he carried himself when he thought no one was watching, in the whisper I sometimes caught in the hall at night. Perfect, perfect. And then one morning, I found it. A photograph on the living room wall, one I hadn't touched. It was a picture of my brother and me from years ago. Except now, subtly, unmistakably, the face was slightly wrong. The eyes, the expression, the angle of the jaw, all mirrored the imposter's. And there in the corner, faintly scratched into the background, a single word: mine. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. Even though my brother had come back, even though the imposter had been defeated in the woods, he had left a mark, not a physical scar, not a memory, a replacement of familiarity itself. My bond with him, once unshakable, was now tinged with doubt. Was this truly him? Or had the wrong child, even in absence, changed what it meant to be him? The truth settled like dust in the house, heavy, permanent, irrevocable. That night, I awoke to the sound of breathing outside my door. Soft, steady, familiar, and a whisper: "I'm the right one now." The words weren't reassuring, they weren't comforting. They were claiming, staking territory, a subtle dominance I couldn't ignore. Because even though the imposter had left, even though my real brother had returned, the line between them had blurred. And in that blur, I could see it, the presence, the seed, the lingering shadow of something that would never truly leave. The house looked normal in the morning light. The routines, the rituals, the smiles, all in place. Parents oblivious, friends oblivious. Even my brother seemingly back, normal enough for anyone else. But I knew. I always knew. Because some truths are too subtle to explain, too quiet to show, and too dangerous to ignore. And sometimes, the wrong kid really does come home, even when the right one returns. You listened till the end because somewhere this story connected with you. If you heard something, don't look back, move forward, and be silent. This channel is for those who enjoy stories that stay in their mind long after they're over. If this story gave you that feeling, support the channel by subscribing it and stay connected with me in this video.